Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 14, Individuals and Families of European Descent. This chapter defines Europe as a distinct region, and we know that that could actually involve people from very different experiences who might identify as members of this group that we're studying. So physical features and cultural practices are important. Many people who identify with this group may also identify as Christians, but the experiences might be vastly different. So we might have people who aren't even sure what generation they are, so they may identify and say, oh, I am German and Polish, but they may not be sure if it was their great-great-grandparents or even further back in the history from that. Well, this chapter also encompasses groups of people, though, that have more recently immigrated from Europe, so it's important to know that we're kind of covering both ends of the spectrum in that way. This chapter is also unique because it talks about the development of a white American ethnic identity. And this sometimes is a very new even concept to students, because sometimes we think of the white American identity as almost the default. And when we become more multiculturally competent, we realize that that's problematic, because it's almost as if white American culture is the default, then everyone else is the other. And also it invalidates the experience of people that may identify as white Americans, because what are they left with in terms of cultural richness or a history or all of the strengths that we've studied in previous chapters of these different groups? So this chapter really goes through what it means to identify as a white American, and that it means other things other than just devaluing others, but it also comes with a set of privileges and different reactions to those set of privileges. So something that probably isn't new to you, though, is the metaphor of a melting pot. So as many different groups of people immigrated to America, there was this common metaphor that you've probably heard that was explained as the melting pot, different groups of people that were all merged together. Since then, what may be a more accurate metaphor, we're going to use the term salad bowl, in terms of that we know we don't melt together because we don't lose our historical or cultural backgrounds, but instead, we may be right beside others that are either the same or different from us in very close proximity. And that's what makes up the richness and the beauty of the diversity of our country. So in many ways, though, this American ideal, and you've heard of the American dream, it can reinforce things like that the U.S. is this utopia, and what we'll talk a little bit more about in terms of meritocracy. So that's a difficult one. Meritocracy is a little bit easier way to say it. But these are ideals that aren't quite grounded in reality, and when people hold those ideals and they don't quite match up with their experiences, it can be challenging and frustrating for individuals. So we've talked throughout this course about privilege and oppression, and also we've talked a little bit about being ethnocentric, which is something we want to avoid as culturally competent professionals. So we don't want to approach the world from only viewing it from our perspective and viewpoint from our ethnicity. And the problem with ethnocentric monoculturalism is this idea that we're all just one and the same. And so because of that, it invalidates others, and it really can have the tendency to impose the white American reality onto other groups. And that's not something that we want to do. So the factors that perpetuate this, what we call an invisibility of the systematic oppression that is experienced by minorities, there's a few things that go into that. First, we have the myth of meritocracy. So we know that meritocracy means the belief that if you work hard, you can achieve anything. Well, in some cases, when we start out at different starting points, we may have to work extra hard to get where someone else started out. And so it's really not entirely true that if you work hard, you can achieve exactly the same as anybody else. So that is a bit of a myth, or that is a myth. We also know that historically, our culture has used religious or different virtues or belief systems to rationalize taking over another community and what we would call, quote unquote, civilizing a godless or uncivil group of people. So in history, when you read history textbooks, that is often a rationalization for why one group would take over another group, or even stop or bar another group from practicing their cultural beliefs. There's also the idea that racism is just these individual acts of meanness, and so that others are racist and that individual did something that was racist. When we look at it only as that, we fail to see that racism exists in our systems, and that many times that type of racism is most oppressive to groups of people. As I mentioned before, this chapter also talks about what we call the process of becoming white. And so this can be very hard for students to wrap their heads around, meaning, what do you mean I become white? And it really can be the recognition, and maybe you'll have this realization during this course, that being white, whether you identify that or not, it has certain privileges associated with being a part of that majority culture, which white American is currently in the United States defined as a majority culture, not necessarily just because of distribution rates, meaning that there are more people that identify as that, but also by a history that has empowered one group and devalued other groups. So there is a number of disadvantages, though, to also, so in one way, when you become white, which is what our textbook goes through the process of that, you have all these privileges that are relatively unearned, but you still have these privileges. So think back to the backpack that we talked about in a previous chapter. But there's also some disadvantages, and that means that if you come from an identity of another original cultural group, you have to give up that to some degree. And this might be why some white Americans have a really challenge in understanding the concept of cultural in general. So they may not identify their culture or their cultural background because, again, they see it as a default, and so not really as any membership to any particular group. So this can cause conflict and tension not only between other members of the community or other cultural groups, but also even members between even members of different families, because you may identify much differently than your parents or than your grandparents or even than a sibling or a spouse. So it can be challenging also to go through this process of becoming white, where we recognize different privileges that are associated with this membership, but also experience some of the disadvantages. And another disadvantage that can come along with that is the guilt that can be associated with some of the historical acts of oppression that white Americans have perpetuated on others. So this is all part of becoming more culturally aware of the experience while also developing our own self-awareness, which is key. This chapter kind of bounces back and forth between talking about groups of people that may identify as coming from European descent, but may not be sure when or maybe even where they came from exactly. And it bounces back and forth between that experience and then more recent European Americans. So we know that 53 nationalities have been identified under this umbrella. So again, a very diverse group of people, but still it's a group of people that are immigrating to the United States in still fairly large numbers. So we have groups like undocumented immigrants, refugees who come here, who are granted permission to set up residence because they're unable or unwilling to return to their country. And then we also have international students that come from European countries. So as we look through some different counseling considerations that you may use in working with a European client or a client that identifies as white, so one of the challenges that we might not think about is the worldview of seeing problems as individual. And as the problem of the individual. So that means that they may be less likely to be discussed within a family. We've talked about a number of other cultural groups, including those that may come from a Latin descent, an Asian descent, and Native Americans, who tend to solve problems and think about problems as a family and as a group. And so when we look at these two things in contrast, instead of just kind of looking at this as a default, then we can see that in some ways this may be a real challenge to now have it all on the shoulders of an individual to solve their problem without input and support from family members. So, and this has also been traced back to some problems in raising children together and in marriages, because problems are seen as individual rather than shared by the couple or by the parents in the case of child rearing. We also have talked a little bit about in terms of the trouble in clarifying cultural values that many white Americans might face. So sometimes, again, when you ask a student who may identify as white, well, tell me about your culture or your cultural beliefs, sometimes they've looked at me pretty confused and said, well, I'm just a regular American. I'm just a typical American. So that tells me that they're pretty unclear about their cultural values. And so therefore, they may be unclear about potential cultural conflicts or what role that they may play in this. And so they may not be sure of their cultural beliefs or personal beliefs. And this can be really challenging in terms of setting up a relationship that would be most effective for this individual, whether you're working in a counseling setting or a human services setting. And again, bouncing kind of back and forth between individuals that might identify as white Americans and aren't sure of when they immigrated, when their families came here, all the way to more recent immigrants here from European countries. So when you're working with that group of people, you're going to want to look at things like what kinds of stressors was this individual or this family facing before they immigrated, and now what types of stressors are they facing now? Because sometimes we make the mistake of only kind of living in the here and now, when we really need to know what was going on before as well as now if we're working in a professional sense with an individual. So I hope that you'll take the time to review this chapter in coordination. It's an interesting pairing with our previous chapter on Native Americans that we'll look at in this session. But I know for many students in this course, it may be helpful to understand that there is really no default or mainstream or typical or regular American identity. We're really, as the metaphor explained, a salad bowl, which is more helpful than a melting pot, and that white American identity is a cultural identity just as many of the others that we've talked about in this course.